Hi, thanks for joining this podcast. This is the Apologist Bookshelf. I'm Gary Zacharias. I wanted to share with you a second look at a book by Dan Story. It's called Defending Your Faith, Reliable Answers for a New Generation of Seekers and Skeptics. And let me just say that Dan Story is a friend of mine. He and his wife sit down and have dinner with my wife and me. And the guy is just such a warm, personable individual. He has a BA, he's got an MA in Christian apologetics. He's written all sorts of books and booklets, and a very kind individual. I know you like his books. They're written in a simple style, but they're not simplistic. In other words, they give good, thorough reasons for whatever he's talking about. So this book, Defending Your Faith, deals with things like, how do I know God exists? How can I trust the Bible? Why do we have evil and suffering in the world? Is Christianity the only path to God? Are the Bible and science in conflict? And so on and so on and so on. So I did his podcast on his first chapter, Why Does God Want Our Defense? And then the second chapter is what I'd like to look at today. It's called, Why is Atheism a Failure? And he goes back and he said, disbelief in God is certainly not recent. King David, back in Psalm 14 and also in 53, has this statement: the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Story says, atheism has never really attracted a large number of people, but the ones that are out there these days are vocal and antagonistic, and actually atheism, I think, is growing a little bit. And I said we need to respond to their challenges, and I think that's true. Dan says if you're going to talk about this, that we've got to understand something right from the beginning. I think this is a really good point. He said, even if the evidence for God's existence is weak, but he says it's not, but what if even if the evidence would be weak for the existence of God, it doesn't mean God doesn't exist. He said there's no scientific or philosophical or logical reason not to believe that the immaterial spiritual world is just as real as the physical world of our senses. So he says evolutionary science and human psychology, all these atheistic philosophies, they don't have the credentials and they don't have the capability to demonstrate God does not exist. He says, now, it's not difficult to prove that God does exist. He says we'll talk about it in two ways. In the next chapter, which is chapter 3, and we'll do that soon, he says he builds a case for God's existence based on a variety of different evidences. Now, what's the point of this chapter? Now he gets around to it. I said that he'd like to show that atheism, when you think about it as a worldview, it just doesn't work. It fails to explain reality as most of us live it out. It has its own philosophical and moral shortcomings. So I think that's a really important place to start. We always feel pressure on us as Christians to defend our worldview. And so, on the other hand, everybody's worldview needs defending. And I think the Christian one can be defended far more robustly than something like the atheist worldview. So he says, what's wrong with atheism? He says it's an anomaly. He said people are not born atheists. You look in Romans and it says God's placed an awareness of himself in the heart and mind of all of us. He says people become atheists by suppressing this knowledge of God. They have to hold it down. That's in Romans 1:18. And they're exposed to secular ideas and philosophies that may head them toward atheism. He said belief in supernatural beings is actually a universal ingredient in just all sorts of human cultures, whether it's the technology like ours or maybe primitive ones, some of the societies scattered around the earth. So he said for most people, the issue isn't, gee, I wonder if God exists. They're wondering what the deity is like. Is God one? Is he many? Is he personal? Is he impersonal? Is he good and fair? Or maybe he's harsh and capricious. So he says, if you argue, like atheists do, that religious beliefs are rooted in primitive superstitions, he said, how is that, then, that there are multiple millions of bright, educated, modern people from all sorts of walks of life and cultural backgrounds? They're convinced God does exist and has revealed himself in ways that could be investigated and experienced. Atheists dogmatically assert that God doesn't exist, but they can't explain why there's a worldwide phenomenon of belief in God. And they can't explain why so many former atheists who have investigated biblical revelation have become committed Christians. Yeah, I think that's true. He has a quote here from Norm Geisler. The denial of the reality of the transcendent, meaning God, entails the assertion that not only some people have been deceived about the reality of God, but that indeed all religious persons who have ever lived have been completely deceived into believing there's a God when there really isn't. It says this is back to Dan's story here, that it's unbelievable that every saint in the history of the world, and even Jesus, was completely deceived about the reality of God. So he says, let's get on to the next point here. He's talking about atheism is indefensible. Why? Well, he said, think about the total amount of knowledge that any single person has. How much is that compared to the universe? It's infinitesimal, right? It's very, very small. And we have a very tiny amount of information. A person would have to be omnipresent and omniscient to have enough information to know that no deity exists. I mean, it's like me saying there's an animal, let's say, some kind of animal, let's say zebra. I look in my backyard and I don't see a zebra, and I say, therefore, zebras don't exist. Well, I'd have to explore more than my backyard, wouldn't I? I'd have to look in my neighborhood. I'd have to look in my state. I'd have to look in my nation. I'd have to look in the continent I live in, and so on until I could decide if a zebra exists. So he says, each person has such limited smallness, amount of knowledge compared to how big the universe is. So he said, God could exist beyond our comprehension or our experience. That makes sense. He says it's true that the burden of proof is on the person who asserts something, but the atheist who has asserted there's no God is wrong for two reasons. First, and that's what he's going to do in the next chapter, he's going to show that we as Christians have ample objective evidences to demonstrate the existence of the Judeo-Christian God. So if atheists say God doesn't exist, they got to be prepared to explain why. The second reason the atheist burden of proof argument doesn't work is Christians have a credible source, a document called the Bible, which testifies to the existence of God. If atheists want to challenge the existence of God, they have to prove that the document, the Bible, is not true, it's spurious. He says there's another reason Christians would like atheists to confront Scripture. The Bible will bring atheists face to face with the fact that God exists, but it also reveals the true nature of God in the person of Jesus Christ. Okay, here's another problem with atheism, Dan says. It doesn't provide meaning and purpose to life. Okay, let me say that one again, because as a teacher, I've taught a lot of students over the years. I can't tell you how many have come to me in tears and said, what's the point? There's no purpose to life. I don't know why I'm here. I don't know what I'm doing. And that's what you get if there's no God out there. But anyway, so Dan says atheism fails to provide meaning and purpose. Why? It can't offer an alternative worldview that explains reality as most people understand it and live it out. It doesn't answer to any satisfaction the big questions of life like this. Why am I here? Where did I come from? What happens after death? Why is there evil in the world? What's the problem with the human race? How do you fix it? Atheism doesn't answer the big questions. It's not a good worldview. So in the world of atheism, where there's no God, think about what they say about humans. What are we? A cosmic accident. How do we come about? Random, mindless, evolutionary forces. What's our purpose? There isn't any. There's no ultimate purpose. There's no meaning to our existence. There's no explanation for evil and suffering. And then certainly there's no hope of a solution, either now, in this life, or in the age to come. So every human, Dan says, recognizes and wants so badly for life to have meaning and purpose that there are such things as true moral values. In other words, there are real rights and real wrongs, and that people have worth and deserve to be treated kindly and fairly. But he said if atheism is true and God does not exist, there's no objective or even any kind of basis for belief in any of those human traits. So what do you end up with? Despair. He quotes a person who said he's traveled around the globe and he's found the idea of committing suicide is getting to be conspicuous among youth. And I've seen that up close. I agree with that. And he says, no amount of philosophizing. Go ahead, philosophize. Sit around and think great thoughts. But if you do that, about a world that doesn't have a God, you don't get any hope. No hope at all. Here's another problem with atheism. It fails to benefit humanity. Yeah, well, Christianity certainly has had some black pages, no doubt. Think about slavery, persecution of witches, Spanish Inquisition, Crusades. Actually, some of those I have talked about in the past, and I think you can't whitewash them, obviously, but they may not be as bad as people have been led to believe. Anyway, so those are some negatives about Christianity, but Christians themselves have condemned them, and it's certainly incompatible. All those things are incompatible with what Jesus taught. But even if they were committed by Christians, some of these awful acts, they don't disprove God's existence or Christianity is false. In fact, it says usually what happened is, how do we get rid of those practices? It was biblical values and biblical principles. So let's think about Christianity. What's benefited the human race the most? There's no other religion, there's no other secular philosophy comes even close to Christianity as far as benefiting the human race. I mean, just a few things here. By the way, there are books that talk about this, the positive effect of Christianity on civilization, but here's part of it. Christians opposed abortion and infanticide when they were in the Roman Empire. Christian relief agencies often go first on the scene anywhere. Think about Samaritan's Purse. Christianity has embraced women's rights. They established Christian welfare programs. Christians advanced other social reforms. Many of our, in fact, most, I would say, of our great universities were originally founded by Christians. Hospitals, orphanages, charity organizations, begun and operated by who? Christians. Well, what about the atheists? Atheism has never benefited any society that has been able to gain some kind of political control of. In fact, it's made things a whole lot worse. It is staggering, Dan says, the number of people who have been murdered under atheistic governments compared to the number of people killed under the banner of Christianity. He quotes one man, historian, who says, taken together, all right, here come the bad ones again for Christianity, Crusades, the Inquisition, witch burnings, may have killed something like 200,000 people. Okay, that I guess that's in the ballpark. Says that's equivalent of 1 million deaths today. Says even so, those deaths caused by Christian rulers, and that's over a 500-year period of time, that's 1% of the deaths caused by Stalin, Hitler, and Mao in just a few decades. Okay, so let me run that by you again. Something like 200,000 people may have been killed because of Christianity. That'd be the equivalent of 1 million today. But think about Stalin, Hitler, and Mao. That was only 1% of the deaths they caused in just a few decades. So one researcher estimates 150 million people were killed under atheistic governments in the 20th century. Here's another problem with atheism. It has no objective verification. Right? Atheists reject any kind of immaterial or supernatural realities, and they've got to scientifically test anything to make sure it's true. Well, it says claiming God doesn't exist because it's beyond scientific testing. That's a philosophical statement. That's not even science. And how can you prove scientifically that all knowledge is derived from science? But how do you prove that? Well, a statement like that, to be scientific, has to be observable, testable, and repeatable through experimentation. But the spiritual dimensions of God, for example, of that reality, that's beyond testing of science. He says there are many things that science takes for granted that aren't observable or fully understood, but we consider them factual, like black holes, dark matter, quarks. So scientists readily accept the existence of these phenomena because the evidence at least points toward them. So it said, in fact, if you think about scientific discoveries recently in the last few decades, it's actually aiming toward God. Studies in DNA and the irreducible complexities on the cellular level, the anthropic principle, meaning the fine-tuning of the universe to be just right for us being here, Big Bang cosmology, all of this really points toward a creator, and he covers that in more detail later on. All right, as he begins to wind up, here's another part that he's saying that why is atheism a failure? He says the new atheists, right? They popped on the scene about the year 2000 or so. Says the new atheism fails to deliver any new arguments. Yeah, it says, boy, these guys have become such outspoken, popular book authors, and they're lecturers, and they've been all over the place. People like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett and Christopher Hitchens and others. Boy, they're the ones that are spearheading this new atheism. Charge ahead. Go ahead and smash Christianity. But what's interesting is that new atheism has no new evidences that cast doubt on the existence of God. Let me stop here just for a second and tell you that there's a really interesting debate between Christopher Hitchens and Frank Turek, Turek. Just type in a Google search and you can find the debate. And so I watched that. I watched it more than once. And it's interesting because Turek brings out all the evidences for the existence of God, like the Big Bang and like the fine-tuning and all this kind of stuff. And Hitchens is just there to mock. He's there to have sarcastic comments. And I'll admit, he was witty. He was really interesting to listen to. But he never had an argument to say, this is why I'm sure there is no God. All he said was, it's a stupid idea to believe in God. And religion has done bad things. But you notice that's not defeating the idea of an existence of a God. So they have no new evidences. They just restate their old, worn-out evidences and arguments used by atheists in past generations. Here's an apologist, Paul Copan. Here's what he said about these new atheists. He says their arguments against God's existence are surprisingly flimsy. Says the atheist philosopher of science, Michael Ruse, said that Dawkins' arguments are so bad he's embarrassed to call himself an atheist. Here's another individual that Copan quotes. His name is Terry Eagleton. He's an English literature and cultural theory professor. He says Dawkins and Hitchens, quote, invariably come up with vulgar caricatures of religious faith that would make a first-year theology student wince. The more they detest religion, the more ill-informed their criticism of it tend to be. I would say that's exactly right. Somebody once kind of kidded around. They said, Christopher Hitchens says this, there is no God, and I'm mad at him. And that's exactly right. He's called God like a North Korean dictator. I mean, he's angry, but he has no really good arguments. So Dan, as he's wrapping up the chapter, says what's new about the new atheists is their militant attitude and their hostile tactics. Said this breed is aggressively trying to get rid of anything religious from the public square. In fact, I've heard one of them, I can't remember who, said that they thought if you taught your kids about God, that's child abuse. Right? So they not only want to proclaim their atheist ideology, they want everyone else to reject religious belief and join them. Said that seems kind of odd. Everybody today is supposed to be tolerant, but there's no tolerance in the new atheists. Yeah, exactly. So at the end of the chapter, I like this because he does a summary. He said that he presented several reasons why atheism as a worldview is an utter failure, and here they are. It's an ideology that doesn't work. It's a worldview that hasn't benefited society in any measurable way. It can't answer life's most perplexing questions. It has no purpose. It doesn't suggest any ultimate meaning and purpose to life. It's not in harmony with the beliefs and values of the vast majority of people around the world. And it says in societies where atheism has gained political power, what's happened? Humanity has been denigrated, and the whole world's civilization has been worsened. So he says this chapter has laid out a case against atheism by focusing on its failures. Atheism can't fill the God vacuum it wishes to create. Yeah, exactly right. So that first chapter that we just did is dealing with why atheism doesn't work. And then he flips it around. We'll do this in a future podcast. Chapter 3 is how do we know God exists? And I think that would be something that's a good challenge that all of us should have. I don't know, I'd say just at least a quick 30-second or 1-minute presentation ready for anybody who says, why would you believe in God? We need to have that. Why do we believe there's a God? So I'll let you think about that one. We won't talk about that one right now. Well, thank you so much for being part of this podcast. Again, the book is Defending Your Faith, and the author is Dan Story. Neat guy. Okay, thanks. Take care.